Well, thanks. It's good to be back here again. I had the honor to serve on the board of the ACCJ with Merrill, was at the time there, and many others here. So it's good to come back. Today, I thought I would. I think we've kind of zoned out on the CNN heads and the Fox heads and whatnot. So I wanted to talk about the election, not in the context of the current, but in a little bit of a historical background. Because I think there are two things that are important for me in what I want to present today. The first thing is that in spite of the vituperativeness of this current campaign, this is nothing new, believe it or not. We've been here, and in fact, it's I don't know if you can use the adjective great, but it is part of a long tradition of American politics. That's the first point I would like to make. Secondly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the foreign policy impact of these elections, or the lack thereof, depending upon the case. Because there's been a lot of discussion in this current campaign about such things as building a wall between Mexico, or putting all Middle Eastern Muslims in a database, or carpet bombing here or there. I wanted to say that in some cases, not all cases, these words do have impact. So sometimes in a couple of campaigns, they have actually translated into policy. So in order to provide that kind of an insight, which I hope is an insight, I'm going to take a look at 3 elections. And they're very diverse, and they're not an election that we've had in the past 40 plus years. And that's the election of 1916, Wilson and Charles Evans Hughes; the election of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie; in the election of 1968, which is Nixon and Humphrey. Hence, the title of my presentation today was "The Whole World is Watching." And those of us who are old enough to remember 1968 remember the students on the streets, and that is precisely what they were chanting at the police at that time. So let me start. The 1916 election is really an interesting one. Now, believe it or not, in spite of all the close elections we've had, in the 20th century, only twice has there been an election decided by one state. Only twice. Now, I think most of us can remember one, right? In which my wonderful home state of Florida played a crucial role, and that is the 2000 election. The other time when the election was decided by one state was the 1916 election, and it was decided by California. And what happened was the Republicans had nominated a Supreme Court justice by the name of Charles Evans Hughes, who, by the way, under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, would be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But after he had run for president, got reappointed to the Supreme Court. During the course of that campaign, many on the Republican side had accused, as World War I had begun, remember, in 1914 in August, but had accused the Wilson administration of weakness in the face of things such as the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. And so this weakness and cowardice call was frequent in those who were supporting Charles Evans Hughes. Bear in mind, this is not terminology that Hughes ever used, but his supporters did. In fact, one of his biggest supporters was Theodore Roosevelt, who, as you know, had been president from 1901 to 1909, had run in that fabulous campaign of 1912 when Theodore Roosevelt finished second to Wilson as the only he didn't run as a Republican, he ran as a member of the Progressive Party, or a Bull Moose Party, and it was the only time in the 20th, 21st, up until now, that a third-party candidate finished second in electoral votes. He had 88 votes in the Electoral College versus Taft, the Republican had 8. Theodore Roosevelt, said that Wilson's slow, pedantic foreign policy vis-a-vis Germany should make the United States change its symbol from the eagle to the tortoise, because it was so slow and so pedantic. The election was really, really tight, and Wilson covered many of the states, but California was up in the air. So Hughes was encouraged to go to California to campaign. California was the worst place that he could have gone because the state was totally divided. And the governor of California was a fellow named Hiram Johnson. And Hiram Johnson was the head of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. And he was a major rival of someone from the very conservative wing of the Republican Party by the name of William H. Crocker. The old guard, the progressive Republicans in the state of California were rising in power. Progressives were, the conservatives, the old guard as they were called, were retreating. And so the old guard, however, had contacts and influence in Hughes's campaign, and they were able to control the agenda of Hughes when he visited California. So he got organized by the right wing of California, in that right wing in the definition of the time. In opportunity after opportunity, Hughes lost an opportunity to speak to the progressives, to participate in parades that were organized by the progressive wing of the party in California. And one night, to knock it all off, to put the icing on the cake, before he was about to leave California, and he was in Long Beach, and he was staying in a place called the Hotel Virginia. And no one had told him that Hiram Johnson, the governor, running for the Senate, was staying in the same hotel. And Hiram Johnson arrives at the hotel under all of these festivities, and he asks, "What's going on?" And they said, Republican nominee, Supreme Court Justice Hughes will be arriving here to spend the night. Well, Johnson was tired, so he decided to go to bed with the full expectation that later in the evening, for sure, Hughes would knock on the door and give him an evening greeting. It never happened. Hughes was never told that. Hughes was never told that Johnson was staying in a hotel that night. And Johnson had a very long memory. He remembered slights, and it cost Hughes the election by a little over 3,000 votes. Had Hughes been able to engage, had Johnson engaged, most observers of the time and subsequently believed that he would have won the state, which were 13 electoral votes, enough to swing the election toward Hughes. And so, some historians have said it could have had major repercussions. The Germans felt at the time that Wilson was not ready to fight. Remember, what was Wilson's platform? We're too proud to fight, right? Another one was, he kept us out of war, right? So the thinking was that if Wilson were to win, that the chances of a slower American engagement in the war would indeed be the case. Germany believed that Hughes would fight. And so with Wilson in Germany, in the case of Wilson, Germany unleashed submarine warfare against merchant class shipping, whereas the thinking is that they may not have been as ready to do that had Hughes been elected. In any case, that's a question of, who knows if that's true or not, at the end of the day, whether or not that would have changed the course. There are some who said that if the United States had entered the war earlier, a shooting war earlier, that the war would have come to a close earlier, maybe by a year or two? And would this have diminished the chances of the rise of Nazism in Germany? It's all conjecture. We just don't know the answer to that. But at any rate, this is I raise this in terms of whether or not elections have consequence. And if you understand that dichotomy in the argument, you would say there could have been a consequence out of that. Let me turn to the second election. And this is Wendell Willkie versus Franklin Roosevelt. Now, on the face of it, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because Willkie was really wiped out by Franklin Roosevelt. There is no politician in the 20th century that even approaches the dominance of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in every set of analysis. And I'm going to recommend a book to you. I don't often do this, but I will here. It's a really good book because it also helps you understand a little bit about the nature of how vituperative American politics can get. And this book is called Those Angry Days, Roosevelt, Lindbergh, and America's Fight Over World War II, 1939 to 1941. It's written by a woman named Lynn Olson. And one of the things that you're struck by when you read this book, and I did about 2 years ago, the language that is employed vis-a-vis the political actors of the time. You could just rip off 1939 and 1940 and put back on, 2016, and you basically would get it. It's the same kind of, and it's on both sides. So there's no monopoly from a partisan perspective. The Roosevelt people accused the isolationists of being Nazis and traitors, very openly, for being slow to engage to engage what was happening in the world at the time. Roosevelt was struggling, of course, at the time to get the United States more involved in the conflict, but he understood the politics of it. And the politics were such that he couldn't move as rapidly as he wanted to. So he moved at the edges, cleverly moved at the edges with things like the Lend-Lease Act, which was a means of stepping in greater than any other time period in which you're so-called loaning 50 destroyers. No one has ever explained to me how you loan destroyers. When you're loaning destroyers in a war, this would be, and the Germans regarded it as an act of war. So the same kind of vitriol that we face today. Of course, the Third Reich had invaded, by that time, the Rhineland, Poland, France, Norway, on and on. In Asia, as you well know, Japan's war in Asia was about to widen much beyond China. And so, with all of this happening, and Roosevelt had been elected already twice, there'd never been a president of the United States elected for 3 terms, although Grant had thought about it until the corruption scandals hit him. Roosevelt edged his way into running for a 3rd term. In fact, even his closest confidants were not told that he would indeed try to run for a 3rd term. People like Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State, kind of wanted to run for president, and Roosevelt encouraged him to think in those terms, and then had no intention of not running. People like James Farley, who was the Postmaster General, who was a very big political actor of the time, also had indicated an interest. And Vice President James Garner, who had been for 2 terms Vice President of the United States, and who is once supposedly said when he was sitting alone at his Senate office, because the Vice President is also President of the Senate, he had nothing on his desk, and constituents walked by his door, and he looked out at him and said, "Hey, someone, please throw me a peanut." So this was the atmosphere moving into the election of 1940 that we encountered. And what Roosevelt, I think, very cleverly tried to do, in addition to edging the way into conflict, which he thought was so important for U.S. interests. He started to name Republicans to the cabinet. He named Frank Knox to be Secretary of the Navy. He named Stimson, who had been Secretary of State under Hoover, to be Secretary of War. So you had now the beginnings of a bipartisan platform before moving toward conflict. And this was what the old master conceived of as we moved toward into 1940. The Republicans looked upon Roosevelt's push to increase defense spending with great suspicion. They felt that it was just another way for Roosevelt to cover up all of the domestic failures they accused him of having in the New Deal. We have to remember that by the end of 1939, by the end of the 1930s, believe it or not, the Great Depression had not really ended. Often said it had, but it hadn't. You know, after the Great Depression, we had the Great Recession in the late 30s. And there's an argument to be made that the greatest public works plan of the time was called World War II, because it's World War II who eventually drags the American economy out of its morass. The Republicans had several candidates up and they were all newcomers in 1940. Robert Taft, the son of William Howard Taft, who had been president after Roosevelt from 1919 to 1913, was a candidate from Ohio. Thomas Dewey, the public attorney in New York, was regarded as a top candidate at the time. William McNary, who was a prominent senator from Oregon, was also a newcomer, was a face. Vandenberg from Indiana, who was Wisconsin rather, quite a liberal, was regarded as a great possibility. And then there was the freshest face of all, and that was a fellow who had never run for public office. He was a corporate tycoon. He was a former Democrat. And he was known as a bombastic but dynamic speaker. He had tremendous grassroots support that he mobilized. And he generated a really powerful movement. In fact, the Republican Party was so concerned about his rise that they created anti-Wilkie parties to make sure that he could never win the nomination at the Republican convention. And it wasn't Donald Trump. It was Wendell Willkie, who faced the same kind of reaction. Now, during the campaign, he did accuse Franklin Roosevelt of warmongering, which was standard line for the Republican Party at that time. But in reality, Willkie was a little bit like Trump in the sense that he was a little bit more of a Democrat than he was a Republican in many areas. And in fact, he was a so-called one-worlder. And the importance of Wendell Willkie's race against FDR is that for the most important time of all, he gave President Roosevelt cover for getting into World War II. Because here now you had the Republican nominee whose views on entering the war is basically the same. Basically the same. And he would not run against any further effort by FDR. And in fact, FDR was so fond of that and so respectful of Wendell Willkie. And by the way, Willkie would later go out 2 years later and write a book that became, in many ways, the foundations for the theory of the creation of the United Nations. It's called One World. And you should read it. And I think importantly with Willkie, in 1944, when the vice president for Roosevelt at the time, Wallace, remember Wallace was a very left-wing Democrat at that time, and FDR wanted him to step aside. Franklin Roosevelt seriously gave thought to bringing Wendell Willkie in to be his vice presidential candidate in the 1944 election. At the end, he didn't. Instead, he picked a fellow named Harry Truman. But it might have been interesting had Wilkie won. However, Wilkie died in October of 1944, suddenly at the age of 52. And of course, Roosevelt would pass away the following April. So that's the second campaign that I wanted to show you how that was important in the sense that this candidate had international repercussions because it gave Roosevelt some cover. Now, let me turn to my third and last race here. And this one is a lot closer to home. And some of us here, I'm dating myself, I'm sure, but some of us will remember this not simply because of the impact it had, like the Vietnam War and whatnot, but what I'm going to talk about here, I specially chose for this group because this electoral promise had major impact on U.S.-Japan relations. And this is 1968. So the country is divided in 68, as you well know. There was a big challenge to Lyndon Johnson. Eugene McCarthy had announced earlier, and then Johnson dropped out of the race in February of 1968. Robert Kennedy entered the race, and then we faced this tremendous tumult in the United States with a series of tragic assassinations, first of Martin Luther King, then Robert Kennedy. So the Democrats rolled in. Bear in mind, in 1968, there are only 12 primary elections in the country, and this is another big difference from today. The other elections I was talking with, back in 1912, there were 7 primary elections. By 68, there are only 12 primaries. So the ultimate nominee of the Democratic Party in 1968 never campaigned in a primary. It was totally from the convention itself, which would later cause a lot of reform in the Democratic Party's approach to the primary system. And I'll tell you about that in a second. And that's why, when the Democrats arrive at the convention, and there's so much political activism in the country that all of the Vietnam War demonstrators, and then when Mayor Daley released the police on the demonstrators, which arguably caused more havoc than the demonstrators themselves, the chants, as I mentioned, by the demonstrators was, the whole world is watching, the whole world, because this was now broadcast around the world, in addition to the demonstrators shouting Sieg Heil, which was a little bit more abrasive than the whole world is watching thing. So this is the environment that we come into. Now I'm going to backstep for just 1 second because it's very important to understand this and understand how Richard Nixon reacted to this whole environment. And I'm going to backstep just once here. I'm going to backstep to the 1956 election. Very quickly, what happens is that Adlai Stevenson is the Democratic nominee. The Republicans renominate President Eisenhower, okay? Adlai Stevenson is one of the most liberal candidates that the United States has ever nominated. And what states does Adlai Stevenson, this liberal intellectual, carry in 1956? No, he lost Illinois. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Arkansas, and 2 New England states, okay? Fast forward 8 years. Johnson versus Goldwater. And what states does Goldwater win in 64? We're talking 8 years. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. One of the most conservative candidates that has ever been nominated. 8 years. And as I raised this to a number of people before, why? What happened in 8 years? Anybody? Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, okay? And as Johnson himself said, we have lost the South for a generation. It's critical to understand that if you want to understand Nixon's electoral strategy in the 1968 election. It was known as the Southern Strategy. And these elections of 56 and 64, Nixon understood very well. And he wasn't the only one who understood, because an independent party rose in 1968 and actually won some of those states, led by George Wallace, the American Independent Party. So the whole Southern strategy was apparent even then. And I would argue it's apparent today. So if you really want to understand what's happening today, you need to have a better understanding of the Southern strategy and how that affects the election of today. Now, importantly, how Nixon handled this was he saw this, he understood it, and he also felt that South Carolina was a key state, which it was. And he approached Strom Thurmond, who was a senator at the time, former governor, and had been the nominee of the so-called Dixiecrat Party in the 1948 election. Remember, the Democratic Party had had its 2016 in 1948. It split, right? And former Vice President Wallace led the liberal end of it. Strom Thurmond was leading the southern end of it, and then in the center there was Harry Truman. The importance here is that Nixon understood the power that Strom Thurmond still had in a lot of those key states. He goes to Strom Thurmond, and he basically says, I need your help, and I need South Carolina. How can we help you help us? And Strom Thurmond said, we need to have a pro-Southern vice president on your ticket. We need to have someone who's sensitive to some of the working class issues in that area. And we need to wipe out imported textiles. So this is the heart of the textile issue between the United States and Japan, was that election, and how it was a campaign pledge to Strom Thurmond. In order to back that up, he made sure that Strom Thurmond understood that three of the key people he would bring into his administration, two of them were from Strom Thurmond's office, and would ride on top of this textile issue. And he brought them in, and one of them to help negotiate the textile issue. Now, this on top of the fact, this is what I call the low politics of the issue. This on top of the fact that the high politics of the issue by this time was Okinawa. So you had these two things juxtaposition. You had the textile issue, which is not earth-shattering, and then you had Okinawa, which was, in the case of Japan, was of vital interest. It was not as much with the United States, although for the bases it certainly was. But with respect to textiles, neither one of those issues were vital interest to the United States or Japan. Japan took great umbrage at the fact of the way it was handled. But in matter of fact, both the textile industry in Japan and the textile industry in South Carolina were dying. These were two dying industries. But it played a key role in the campaign. And with that, and I hope I've stayed within my time bound somewhat, I'm going to throw the floor open. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Skip. Wow. Questions, please raise your hand. I'll recognize you, state your name, affiliation, and give us a short question so that we can have lots of them. I think you've stunned everyone.
And it doesn't have to be only about, if you really want to get bored, I can tell you about the 1828 election, the 1824 election, and go on and on.
Okay.
So
state your name. Wait for the mic, please, so that everyone can hear. Bill.
Yes, my name is Bill Bishop. I'm with Becton Dickinson. About the Southern strategy, we've seen in the primaries, of course, Hillary's Southern strategy was to build up votes across the South, which has acted somewhat as a firewall against Bernie Sanders' surge here that she may have predicted or felt might happen, and you can see it's worked this far, and New York is kind of a turning point in that primary, the Democratic nomination. In the Republican nomination, you see that Trump, once he found out that maybe his performance candidacy was more than that, discovered that the Southern strategy for him was to go the opposite extreme and lit up the South with rather flamboyant language, and was able to then blunt the Ted Cruz strategy, which really had everything to do with the South. He thought he'd get the Bible Belt, and when that didn't happen, that blunted his progress. So in the general election, I guess, looking forward, if you can agree or disagree with what I said there, but in the general election going forward, you said that the Southern strategy would play a role. Which swing way is this thing going to go then, and how are the parties going to play it?
I think it's partly going to depend on who they ultimately nominate, but I think that it's a tough road for Hillary to carry a lot of those southern states still. And I think that that particularly states such as Mississippi, Alabama, certainly South Carolina, and several other states are going to be a tough one for the Democrats to edge into. I think there are going to be some surprise states where the Democrats could probably do well, because I think they've already headed toward being so-called purple. And I think Georgia is more in play than it has been in the past. And I think Florida certainly will be hard for them. But it's still the remnants and the power of the Southern strategy is that I think it still works in many ways. That split that occurred in 1948 has ramifications for how politics are carried out in the South. So I think that it's going to be a challenge for the Democrats to overcome that in the South.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you one. The Trump phenomenon is really significant this time. People didn't have your historical knowledge, I suppose, but why did so many people miss it?
Well, I missed it too. I will say I felt myself that I thought he was a clown, but I think I misjudged that. I think he was a lot smarter than a lot of us give him credit for. It's not necessarily the kind of smarts that I sit around admiring all the time, but it worked in many ways. So I think that a lot of people were fooled by that, and I think there are two other factors. One, there was the establishment and the elite underestimated the anger factor in the United States. I certainly did. I don't know about any of you, but I have been a little taken back by it. And I think that has played a major role. Secondly, I think that, the whole reality TV thing is part of the culture today. Like it or not, it's there. And he was able to take advantage of that in a very effective way. And I think those are factors that we didn't. I think I began to feel that he was for real probably around November. And with some of my friends, I couldn't speak out much because I was ambassador then, as much as I wanted to. I kept my mouth shut. But privately, I said I think that people should watch this a little bit, take it more seriously. So I think that those are at any rate, the factors that I just mentioned were the things that were not read effectively.
Okay, thank you. Next question. There in the back, please. Wait for the microphone, please.
Hi, Tony Andriotis, Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed. I think since we've introduced the Trump factor, we know that there are a lot of nervous people, especially overseas. So my question is going to be a calming one. Could you give us some examples of where a candidate has stated something that may be out there, and then when that candidate gets elected, they change their position once coming to office? Historical examples, please.
Well, I guess the one that comes to just off the top of my head, I think is Reagan, because I think that some of the rhetoric that candidate Reagan used was not translated in the end to some sort of I think it was just after the Panama Canal treaties were passed, there was talk about reopening the negotiations, if not actually taking the Panama Canal Zone back. That never got even near having any life. And there are a number of occasions where I think he charted the campaign a little bit to the right when I think he came back a little bit further to the center. I don't think he turned out to be anything like some of the Democrats had feared. And by the way, to be clear on this, even though I was an Obama appointee for 5 years, I also served in the Reagan administration, so that gives me a little bit of balance here, so I know a little about those guys. And there are other cases. Probably, off the top of my head, I'd have to dip into, and I'm sure there are others after that, but I'm thinking about Grover Cleveland and his sort of aggressive campaign toward Mexico in the 1892 election. That was clearly there. Some of the language it never was translated into anything. So I think there are other cases too. Yeah.
Mark, over here, down here front, please.
Skip Mark Davidson from Amway, Japan. In my conversations with people in the Japanese government, both in the Gaimosho and elsewhere, there's clearly a very strong fear that no matter who wins the race in November, that permanent damage has been done in the United States to Japan's image. There's a feeling that particularly among those who we might call low information voters, that the rhetoric about Japan taking advantage of America in trade negotiations and not paying its fair share with regard to its own defense is going to have a lasting impact on Japan's image in the United States. What would your advice be to the Japanese government now about, first of all, is this an accurate impression or not? And secondly, if it is, what can and should Japan do to counteract this lasting damage?
The answer to the second part is nothing. I know I've been here a long time, as you have too, Mark, and I know it's shocking, but believe it or not, Japan ain't real high on the American radar screen. It's there, but it's not, if we were talking about 1983 or 1984, certainly it was higher. But I don't think the average American folks on the street are going to lose too much sleep about the rhetoric. They're going to forget about it. That's what I think. And I think the worst thing the Gaimosho can do is to try to start a campaign to, to generate some sort of a counterplay to this. Because people who weren't thinking about it suddenly will start thinking about it, And I think they need to cool it. And, as long as I've been in Japan, this stuff comes up every 4 years, oh my God, they're saying this, they're saying that. I mean, just chill out, man. So I think I think that they won't have any lasting effect at all. I think if I were in China, I might worry a little bit more on that than Japan.
Okay, the lesson is chill out, man. Okay, who's next? Down here, front table. Over here, the table over here. Okay.
Hello, Mr. MC. As doing business with the United States, I want to ask two questions. One is a business question, and that is a political question. The business question is, when I do business with states, I find both Hillary and Trump, they don't mention one very critical problem about American business, society is I think the biggest problem about American society is the monopoly. monopoly in every industry. You can see only one company that dominate the whole industry, like transportation. In States, you have only two, FedEx and UPS. But in Japan, in such a small country, we have 5. In China, we have 15. So you can see those, every industry, you have only 1 or 2 company. And it's very good for the company. You know, I want to become the company. But it's not good for the most people. Most people, smart people, because you have the domination, the smart guy, they cannot get to the high rank, class. Oh, this is one issue. Another thing is, and no matter, here, Trump or Hillary, which one become the president, do you think they will change the policy about foreign policy or the trade policy dramatically? Because, as doing business with states, so we don't want to see the policy being changed too much, just overnight, everything change. Just we're very concerned about that. Thank you very much.
Well, there's not a lot I can say about the transport industry. I think there are probably people who are more schooled in that around here than I am. But in terms of any dramatic change, I don't think in the norm, I don't think change happens that dramatically in the United States. There's so many actors that get involved in this. I mean, if you have 2 parties dominating the legislative branch and in the White House, and there are big margins in both, then there's a chance that that can happen a little bit more dramatically. But that's not usually the way it works out, and it certainly hasn't been the way it's worked out in the past 25, 30 years. So there will be changes, whoever gets in. I suspect it'll be changes around the edges of policy. Trump, you have to divide between rhetoric and policy. Rhetoric is one thing, but rhetoric doesn't always translate into policy. And I think it actually usually does not. So my sense is that you're not going to have any really dramatic changes, even with a Trump presidency. I think that he would. I think he would get under. This probably gives Trump a few votes if I say this, in the sense that it sounds like the establishment will get him under control. But I think that what I mean is that it's not. They're going to have to deal with the Congress, whoever gets in, and that's something that doesn't turn around overnight in large part. Yeah.
Down here front, please. Here, Marie.
Marie Kissel with Abbott. Since you mentioned the Congress, any projections on how this very competitive race at the top for president, what do you think the effect of that might be? You see people who didn't think a lot of races, especially where you've got incumbent who's a Republican, wouldn't be in play, but now there's concern that maybe Democrats have a better shot because, if disaffected Republicans stay home on election day, or it's all who shows up at the polls, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, I can tell you this with a certain amount of confidence based on some of my conversation I've had with some of my Republican friends. They're certainly worried about it, especially if Trump wins the nomination. Yeah. I mean, if you look at some of the voter polling, I mean, there's some who are saying that 30% won't show up with Trump as the nominee. That is fine, but if it's in states where the Senate is up, that's going to have an effect because people don't show up to vote for a president and don't pay attention to to who's running for the Senate and go home. When you go out there and vote on a slate, as you well know, you go through the whole thing. So it's a concern for them. Sufficient concern that at one point Mitch McConnell said that it would be perfectly okay with him if Trump were the nominee and some of those senators didn't support the Republican Party nominee. That's pretty big. You know, I had not heard that one before. And that says something about how worried the establishment of the Republican Party is. In addition, who was it? Oh gosh, I just can't. One of the well-known pollsters who's often cited on both sides of the aisle, and I'll think of his name, is really well known, has said, I think in the past 2 weeks, that there's even some concern among some Republican observers about the House. Now, I think that's a stretch. I think the House going to the Democrats would be, that would be revolutionary in this environment because of the way that the districts are structured in the United States. And in part, the reason why they structured the way they are, in my view, is that the Democratic Party dropped the ball in terms of how they funded local races. Totally dropped the ball. We focused everything on the executive branch and other areas. We did not focus on state elections as much as we should have in the past, and we're paying a price for that one, beating the House. So, but back to your central question is, you know, I think it is a big challenge if someone like Trump is nominated. And the other thing is that, and same I'm going to say for Sanders, if somehow Sanders were going to be nominated for the Democratic side, he's never done anything for any Democratic candidate. That's part of the measure, right? Hillary, like her or not, she spent 25 years out there on the hustings for Democratic candidates. They all know her. Sanders, who only recently became a Democrat to run, hasn't done any of this. And that's the same thing with a guy like Cruz. He really hasn't been out there. And Trump certainly hasn't, although he's contributed money to both sides of the spectrum. So I think that's the challenge for them. You know, at the end of the day, people look for payback. You know.
Okay. Let's see, Carlo down here. Carlo.
Hello, my name is Carlo Porter. I work with DART Partners. I'm not a US citizen, but I'm very interested in the process for many reasons. There seems to be talk about actually disavowing both candidates on the Republican side and bringing in somebody new sometime soon. How possible is that really, and what does that imply from a political process for the US?
That's a great question that a lot of people have been thinking about, and I certainly have. I think in the past, I think it's a perfectly legitimate argument to say that, you know, coming into the convention without the majority of the delegates and then identifying who that nominee would be during that process was perfectly legitimate. I don't argue that for a second. That was the process then. But as time went on, the primary and the caucus system developed so that the delegates, in the case of the Democratic Party, 10% or less can only come from the state political factors. Those are known as supers. They're still powerful. But at the end of the day, the Republican Party as well, it's the primary system and the caucuses that have driven this. I think the danger, and I don't think the Democratic Party will be brokered. I think it's a long shot, but who knows? And brokered meaning one ballot after another. And by the way, just as a backgrounder, the last time there was a brokered convention was, of course, 1948, the Democratic Convention. And then before that, that means ballot, and then the longest was the 1924 election. There were 103 ballots, 16 days. The first convention ever broadcast on radio nationally in the Democratic Party. And the Democrats had the 103 ballots, and they got clobbered in the 1924 election. So anyway, to come back again to your question, I think the challenge is that if Trump, say, gets within 100 or 150, maybe not that many, but 100, 150 or 50 delegates, and the establishment of the party shifts its weight against what those very enthusiastic voters have supported, I think they're going to have a real trouble. And I think the possibility of a 1968 style reaction is not remote at all. After all, in part of the street demonstrations in '68 were against the convention having chosen Humphrey, even though they only had 12 primaries or caucuses in those days, and now they got 50. So I think it's a real worry, and I think the Republican leadership is worried about it too. And that's why you see a lot of the hedging that's going on. So we don't have an answer as to how it's going to work out. But if we do go, if it is if Trump walks in the convention and he's 300 delegates behind and Cruz is way up there, then I don't think we'll have much to talk about. But I'm saying when it's narrower, I think it could be a real problem. It could. And there is talk out there now of, let's say because what happens is that they're counting on the fact that if Trump loses on the first ballot, he's done. Okay? And then on each subsequent ballot, because what happens is the delegates start to get released. And they have something in American politics called unfaithful delegates. And in the old days, there were a lot more unfaithful delegates than there are today. A lot of states now tie them to the popular vote. By law, I think there are 22 that do that. But when you start going further into the ballot process, then the delegates start getting released. So you go into third and fourth ballots. It's whoever's going to be up there. And so there are some on the Republican side who are talking about bringing Paul Ryan into the process, the Speaker of the House. Is this unprecedented? The answer, it is not unprecedented. And in fact, but the difference is that the primaries and the caucus system didn't exist. But in 1880, it happened. In 1880, a guy who did not even show up to the Republican convention, who had been the Speaker of the House, was nominated and became President of the United States for about 3 months, and then he was assassinated. It was James A. Garfield, 1881 election. So it's happened, but this, again, it's hard to say what happened in the 19th century and somehow, because we have the history there, it's going to be convergent, but it won't be because that process has changed. So anyway, back to your original question, there could be someone that we don't see. It is within the realm of possibility. I think it's unlikely, but it's within the realm. Yeah.
Okay, we had the table in the back. Last table, yeah, gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Arshad Karim with Nikko Asset Management. One of Donald Trump's claims is that he can put into play states that are traditionally Democratic. I'm not sure the polls indicate that, but what's your view on that? Do you see that happening?
Well, I think that, and I think vice versa. I think that there are some states that normally would fall in the Republican range that could come open because Trump is the nominee. So I think it cuts both ways. Trump, up until recently, say the past few weeks, probably is correct in saying that there were more independent voters who were attracted to his message than, say, long-term Republican voters. Probably some truth in that. Having said that, I hear a lot of people talking about the Reagan Democrats. Well, the problem is that the Reagan Democrats today are called Republicans. They went over to the other party, and a lot of them just never came back again. So that one doesn't need. I think that however, as I just said about Trump, he's had some stumbles in the past week or so or more, and how far that translates into his ability to reach out to states that they normally wouldn't get, I can't say. But I suspect it would harm it. Yeah.
Okay, Lance, I think you had your hand up. Middle table here.
Sorry, Roger. Lance Gatling with Nextdoor Research. Hi, Skip.
Hey, Lance.
You've talked about the sort of meltdown scenario for the Republicans with this. You also mentioned in passing, you talked about the evident split in the Democratic Party. Like you, I was in the administration of the Reagan-era administration, serving as an active duty officer, and I was also in the U.S. State Department. I was trained as an IT communications officer, and I will guarantee you that Hillary Clinton has a huge legal liability facing her with this FBI investigation, which is not a security check; it's an investigation, criminal investigation. So let's fast forward, and just for the sake of argument, say that Hillary either developed some new medical problem, she has to withdraw from the race, or she has to get a pardon, or she has to get indicted, whatever. Do you think that the Democrats will actually let Bernie Sanders stand as their candidate? Thank you.
That's a great question. First of all, my good friend Lance and I are known to be in different political parties here. She ain't going to get indicted. There is no grand jury out there, and I think that I don't think she's going to have a health problem, but who knows? That one, I think, has less control over the indictment issue, but that's something we can talk about. That's a legitimate question. Would the establishment of the Democratic Party, I don't see where they'd have a choice. I think that if something happened, and God forbid, with Hillary, I think Sanders would be the nominee of the party. I think many Democrats might hold their nose. Many would not. The one thing about Sanders, like it or not, he's got an incredibly enthusiastic support base. It resembles Trump's. And they are, if the Democratic Party did a bait and switch, like if the Republican Party, I think there would be hell to pay for that. So I can't see it happening. I think that if something were to happen with Secretary Clinton, I think Sanders is the nominee of the party. And I also think he'd win. And there's really no one there, right? I mean, unless they brought Biden back in, who else was, or someone else, O'Malley, or I don't think so. I think Sanders would be it. All hypothetical, of course.
Okay. Here in the middle table.
Roger Marshall with Rogers Berenson. Skip, let's go back to real basics, not the candidates today or so on, but the whole election process and the structure of that. The Electoral College, is this out of date? Is it a remnant of the past when there was no national communications at the speed of light? Should it still exist today? What can you talk to us about that?
It's a good question. I've thought about it, but let's take a look at the Electoral College. I think you know why it came about, and it was basically the framers were worried about the rabble, in a sense. And it has basically worked, with several important exceptions. The 1800 election was where it worked. But then again, we're dealing with an infant country in which the Electoral College, we had a system by which the one who had the most votes won, and the one who had the second most votes became the vice president. I mean, that's how ancient this regime was at that time. And then we had the 1824 election, which was thrown into the House of Representatives, and in which Andrew Jackson had the majority of the Electoral College, even going, had not the majority, but had the plurality, even going in it being thrown into the House. He had the plurality, not the majority. And then in 1828, it was the second election decided in the House of Representatives, right? Where you had four candidates. Crawford of Georgia dropped out, and you had three, and then Clay dropped out, and then you had the big battle at the end. After that's the election of 1876, right? This is again where the Electoral College came into play. You had a situation where the two candidates were in a deadlock, and Hayes won in the Electoral College by one vote, 185 to 184. And then the 1884 election, and 1888, where you had also similar. In 1888, you had Cleveland losing to Benjamin Harrison, and he won the popular vote and lost in the Electoral College. And then going forward, we didn't see that again until 2000. We had close ones. 1960 comes to mind, where Illinois and Pennsylvania were actually swings. That's why it wasn't one state that made the difference in Illinois. And so it happens, but it hasn't happened often. And I'm not saying, therefore, the Electoral College is inviolate. It can be, I think, challenged. But the record of it has not been crippling where we face this situation every 4 years. I don't think we'll face it this time. And by the way, here's another weakness of the Electoral College, and that is unfaithful delegates. We have had, I think, 16 times in American history where the delegates didn't follow the popular vote in their own states. That happened. I tell you, it happened as recently as 2004. Just one example, very small, but you had the state of Illinois, which was voted. The majority was for John Kerry, and one elector just decided he didn't like Kerry, and he voted for John Edwards. No control of that. So the non-faithful delegates, if it became widespread, it would be a problem. But again, the states have tried to get that under control a bit better. I think the Electoral College is going to be with us to stay. I don't see any major movement to change that.
Okay, next question. We have time for about 2 or 3 more questions. You've not mentioned TPP. All of the candidates now seem to be slightly unsure or opposed. Assuming it did not get ratified by the U.S., what impact would that have on Japan, since they've gone so far in progressing it?
Well, to me, I guess I'd change the question a little bit.
Okay.
I think that TPP will be ratified in the United States. It may not look like it does now. So the question is, if there is any kind of change in the language of the TPP, how are the partners going to look at that, and whether or not that opens the whole process up again, and are you looking at a much longer term? I think Secretary Clinton, at the end of the day, for example, will support some kind of TPP. And I even suspect, although I can't speak as clearly for them as not, but I suspect some of the Republicans can, even Trump, some version thereof, but it may not look like it does now. So that, to me, is the real question and answer on that one. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Carlo again.
How strong do you think that Bernie Sanders' policies have been an impact on what the
How strong would, for example, Senator Sanders' proposals or policies be on the other candidate, in this case, Secretary Clinton? So that's a legitimate question. The answer is, I think there is definitely influence. I think in some ways that and I don't think it's bad influence. I think the worst case scenario for me is if there wasn't an opponent for Secretary. I think running on your own without someone in your own party, or having a weekend. I must say to you that Sanders is much stronger than I ever suspected him to be. I've been kind of surprised by it. But I think that he has influenced some of the, if not the basic policies, the way she has articulated them have been influenced by what he has said and how he has said them. So there's no question, and I would argue the same thing is in any party. I think Republican Party, certainly, the candidates are influenced at the edges. It's very rare to see a wholesale change, because then you get you get labeled as a flip-flopper or something like that. But I think on the edges, yeah, sure, he's had influence, populist influence.
Okay, one final question. Hold for the mic now, please.
Just to follow up on the TPP question. We were talking about post-election, would one of the candidates go forward, but as you know, they're going to try to get the TPP passed here in Japan. How that plays in the U.S. or not, or to what influence, that's one thing. But the talk is that maybe in the lame duck they would go ahead and pass the TPP for fear that these candidates coming up in the election may do precisely what you said, start repinning a new agreement.
Yeah.
What do you think?
That's very, very possible. And in some ways, if Secretary Clinton were to win, this would be a way of President Obama sort of giving her an out, saying, this has been done. There could be calls to repeal and whatnot, but I don't think the push would be that hard. But that is a perfectly legitimate scenario, I think.
Okay. With that, Skip, I want to give you an ACCJ mug and a certificate of appreciation. So hold on, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Class dismissed.